desert fathers, hermits, traveling itinerant mendicant priests, and friars. The athletes of God. That's one of the names that I remember most from my church history classes. You see, the Desert Fathers and the Desert Father era was a early time in church history where men and women took seriously the invitation to separate yourselves from the world and to keep yourselves holy. Be separate unto God. And there was a movement of many who wanted to show their devotion by departing the world and secular occupations and to devote their whole lives to the love of God and the service of humanity. With vows of obedience, chastity, poverty, in some cases silence, sacrifice. Many men and women throughout the centuries have set themselves apart to offer their lives as a worship to God. I want to read to you a section from a book that's been meaningful to me. It goes like this. In Louisville, Kentucky, at the corner of 4th and Walnut, in the center of the shopping district, I was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that I loved all those people. That they were mine and I theirs. And that we could not be alien to one another even though we were total strangers. It was like waking from a dream of separateness, of spurious self-isolation in a special world, the world of renunciation and supposed holiness. This sense of liberation from an illusory difference was such a relief and such a joy to me that I almost laughed out loud. I had the immense joy of being a man, a member of a race in which God himself has become or became incarnate. As if the sorrows and stupidities of the human condition could overwhelm me, now I realize what we all are. And if only everybody could realize this, but it cannot be explained. There's no way of telling people that they're walking around shining like the sun. This was called the Revelation. And they are the words of Thomas Merton, a Trappist monk whose movement from the hustle and bustle of the New York, Manhattan city life, urban life, became challenged by his worship of God. And in 1941, he left New York City and moved to central Kentucky, just beyond Bardstown, to a little area called New Haven, to a community that we've come to know as the Abbey of Gethsemane. Thomas Merton lived the rest of his life here and is buried just beyond that hill over my shoulder, right in the courtyards of the Abbey. It's significant that on an errand into Louisville, which is about 60 miles from here, he found himself standing on the most ordinary street corner at one of the most ordinary times and suddenly becoming overwhelmed with the revelation of the essential preciousness of men and women all around him going about their business. There's a picture that I've attached of a historical marker that's been set, and it's called the Revelation, recognizing that Thomas Merton, who had moved away and out of society in isolation and service to God, reframed and redefined what his mission and his vocation came to be. and a new movement arose out of his life for social justice. He may be one of the earlier articulators of the concept of contemplative activism. He unified his heart and the dualisms that suggest themselves to us. Those desert fathers, my favorite is one who goes by the name of Simon Stylites. What does stylites sound like to you? Like stilettos, right? Or like a large pole. Simon, to show his love for God, to be separate from the world and even separate from the other hermits and pilgrims, lived on a pole top for several years. Because if I could demonstrate my dislike for the flesh and buffet my body, as the Apostle Paul would say, and cause it to be in submission to my spirit and to God's voice, then I would be holy. This was why they began to call some of these monks the athletes of God, because they were climbing poles and living in caves and carrying out incredible feats of self-discipline, self-renunciation, and asceticism, leaving the world. And yet a monk on an ordinary errand on an ordinary day came to learn that God would have him be like bread, broken for the world. He lived the rest of his life at this abbey, and yet became the friends of kings and presidents, the Dalai Lama of the time, and took up the social causes of his day. He got into the thick of it. In this module, we're talking about the substance of congruence and the shadow of severance. This capacity that we all have to separate aspects of our lives and our hearts, flesh and spirit, heaven and hell, sacred, secular. These jobs are holy. This kind of speech, if you speak this way, this is the holy way of speaking, instead of using the language that most of the folks around you would understand. Yeah, there are seductions within our spirituality, seductions that, when they have been fully invested, still leave us on the outside of a unified heart and life, which God is seeking to bring us to. So the substance of congruence becomes an invitation. I've come to understand the faith of Jesus to be an invitation for us to get our loves right. You see, when we get our loves right, our lives will be right. And when we have decided that the created order, or some aspect of God's gifts to us that He's left here, or come to when we conclude that He is not jealous of these, He wants us in creation. He sanctified labor before there ever was a fall, saying, "Be like me and work for 6 days and take a rest." Indeed, separated and celebrate, not rejuvenate necessarily, but to recognize that it's not the labor of your hands, but God's abundance as you abide. So the invitation inside of this module with these particular writings is one where we begin to think through how to knit our hearts together, how to live a unified, harmonious life of alignment, and not one of fragmentation, separation from ourselves, or separation from our neighbor at a time that we must be broken like bread, spread out to feed many. I look forward to talking with you about being these kinds of sacramental people, the kinds of folks who stand on street corners and see God speaking and showing Himself as light in the lives of those around Him. I'll see you in the classroom.